Sarah Whitaker was only 7 when her mother took her by the hand and led her through the brick entrance of a foster care home in Des Moines, Iowa. The building looked ordinary enough from the outside. Rows of windows, a playground with a swing set that squeaked when the wind pushed it. But to Sarah, it felt like another planet. Her mother bent down, brushed a strand of hair from her daughter's face, and whispered, "Just for a few days, sweetheart. I'll be back before you know it." Sarah clung to those words as if they were a promise carved into stone. She watched her mother walk away, turning back once with a quick smile, then disappearing through the front gates. That was the last image Sarah held onto. Her mother's silhouette shrinking in the distance, sunlight bouncing off her coat buttons. The staff at the foster home tried to reassure her. They told her it wasn't unusual for parents to leave children there for a short while, especially if they were struggling. Sarah sat on a bunk bed that first night, hugging her small backpack, repeating the words in her head, "Just for a few days. She'll be back." Days stretched into weeks. Each afternoon when the bell rang for visiting hours, Sarah's heart pounded in her chest. She pressed her face to the window, scanning the parking lot for a familiar car, a familiar figure. Nothing. Other kids were picked up by social workers or met with relatives, but Sarah waited alone. A month passed, then another. The staff stopped reassuring her. The older girls in her room told her the truth bluntly: she's not coming back. Nobody drops off a kid here for a couple of days. Sarah shook her head, refusing to believe them. She thought maybe her mother had gotten sick, or maybe lost her way, or maybe... Sarah searched for any reason that would make sense. 1 year turned into 3. Each birthday, Sarah made a wish that never came true. She pressed her hands together at night, whispering into the darkness, "Please let her come tomorrow. Please let her remember me." By the time she turned 10, the truth carved its way into her heart. Her mother had abandoned her. The realization didn't come with one big dramatic moment. It came slowly, like frost crawling over a window pane, until the whole picture was covered in cold clarity. Sarah remembered the life they had before. The small apartment, her mother's steady job, the laughter when they cooked together. They had enough. They weren't rich, but they had each other. So why? Why had her mother walked away from all of that? The question followed her everywhere. It sat with her in the cafeteria as she pushed peas around her plate. It echoed in her head during math class, when numbers blurred into meaningless shapes. Why wasn't I enough? What did I do wrong? The other children found their own ways to cope. Some lashed out, picking fights or throwing tantrums. Sarah did the opposite. She grew quiet. She followed the rules, finished her homework, helped the younger kids tie their shoelaces. Adults described her as a good girl, but beneath the surface, she carried a storm of hurt that never fully showed on her face. When Sarah was finally released from foster care at 18, she walked out with a plastic bag of belongings and a determination that burned hotter than the pain. She would never give anyone the satisfaction of calling her helpless. She would prove that the little girl left behind could become someone worth noticing. Her memories of those waiting years became fuel. She studied late into the night under the flickering light of a shared desk lamp, determined to excel. Every ace she earned was a brick in the wall she was building between herself and the memory of that front gate. Every scholarship application she filled out was another step toward a life her mother couldn't have imagined. Sarah told herself she would find her mother one day, not to beg for love, but to stand in front of her as a woman who had made something of herself. She wanted her mother to feel the sting of regret, to see what she had thrown away. The pain of abandonment didn't fade, but it hardened into resolve. And so, the little girl who once pressed her face against the window, waiting for a mother who never came, stepped forward with her eyes fixed on a different horizon. She would write her own story now, one of survival, strength, and success. She didn't yet know how difficult the road would be, or how much loss still waited ahead. But at 7 years old, standing in that foster home, Sarah Whitaker had already taken her first step into a life shaped by betrayal, and fueled by an unbreakable will. When Sarah was 11, the foster home admitted a new boy named Matthew Whitaker. He was 13, lanky, and carried himself with a guarded silence. Unlike many of the younger children, Matthew didn't cry when the social worker left. He sat on his bed, staring at the floor, his fists clenched so tightly the knuckles turned white. Word spread quickly. His grandmother, the only family he had left, had passed away, and there was no one else to take him in. The other boys sensed his vulnerability. They circled him in the yard one afternoon, taunting him for refusing to join their game. "Too good for us," one sneered. Matthew kept his eyes down, muttering nothing. When one shoved him in the shoulder, he stood rigid, unwilling to fight back but too proud to run. Sarah watched from the steps, her heart tightening. Something in his posture reminded her of herself, how it felt to be the outsider, the abandoned one. She jumped up and ran toward them. "Hey, leave him alone!" she shouted, her small frame standing between Matthew and the pack of boys. They laughed. "What's this?" His bodyguard, one jeered. Sarah didn't flinch. "If you don't walk away right now, I'll tell Mrs. Harris." Mrs. Harris was the no-nonsense supervisor of the foster home, and everyone knew she didn't tolerate bullying. The boys hesitated, exchanged looks, and eventually scattered, grumbling. Matthew blinked at her in surprise. "You didn't have to do that," he said quietly. "Yes, I did," Sarah replied firmly. "They had no right." She offered her hand. "I'm Sarah." After a pause, he shook it. "Matthew." That was the beginning. From that day, they were rarely apart. At meals, they sat together. In study hall, they traded notes. Sarah learned that Matthew had once lived with his grandmother in a small house filled with books and the smell of fresh bread. He had lost his parents in a car accident when he was 2. His grandmother became his world, until illness took her away. Sarah listened, her chest heavy with recognition. She told him her own story, how her mother had promised to return but never came, how birthdays felt like cruel reminders. Matthew didn't pity her. He just nodded, as if to say, "I understand." That silent understanding was worth more than any comforting words. Other kids teased them sometimes, saying they acted like brother and sister. Matthew would bristle, but Sarah laughed it off. "Let them talk," she said. "They don't know what it's like to be us." And truly no one did. They protected each other in small ways. When Sarah was mocked for always keeping her nose in a book, Matthew sat beside her and opened one of his own. When Matthew was punished for sneaking out to the basketball court after curfew, Sarah saved him an extra dinner roll from the cafeteria. Their bond wasn't loud or dramatic. It was steady, like a rope tying them together in a storm. The hardest part came 2 years later, when Matthew turned 16 and was placed in a transitional program outside the foster home. He had earned good grades, and a local construction company offered him part-time work while he attended school. Sarah was proud of him, but the thought of facing the empty halls without him filled her with dread. On the day he left, she hugged him fiercely, her voice trembling. "Promise you'll come back." He looked her in the eye. "Every weekend." "I swear." True to his word, Matthew returned each Saturday. Sarah lived from one visit to the next. She would wait by the gate in the morning, heart leaping when she saw his familiar figure walking up the path. They spent the day talking, sharing stories about school, about the future, about the lives they hoped to build once they were free. For Sarah, those weekends were more than visits, they were lifelines. The weekdays were gray, filled with routines and the ache of waiting. But Saturdays lit up like a holiday, filled with the laughter of 2 kids who had lost everything, yet still managed to find each other. Years later, Sarah would look back and realize that those moments laid the foundation for everything that came after. They were 2 abandoned children who refused to let go of hope. And though neither of them would have admitted it then, their hearts were already intertwined, long before they ever called it love. By the time Sarah Whitaker finished high school, she had earned a reputation as the quiet girl who never gave up. Teachers admired her discipline. Classmates sometimes whispered about her strange determination, while others dreamed of parties and proms. Sarah spent nights buried in textbooks under the dim glow of a desk lamp, convinced that her only way forward was through academic excellence. Her efforts paid off. At graduation, when her name was called, she walked across the stage in her cap and gown to the sound of applause, clutching the scholarship letter that would change her life. The University of Iowa had offered her a full ride, covering tuition and housing. It wasn't just financial relief, it was freedom. For the first time, she could see a future that wasn't defined by abandonment. College opened new doors. Sarah majored in interior design, drawn to the way spaces could be transformed to bring comfort and beauty. She spent long hours in studio workshops, sketching floor plans, experimenting with color palettes, building small-scale models. Professors praised her vision, often remarking that her designs seemed to carry both strength and softness, a reflection of the resilience etched into her character. After graduation, Sarah was offered a placement with a design firm in Des Moines. The firm was small but ambitious, known for taking on projects that revitalized old buildings and gave them new life. The city itself felt like a place of second chances, a mix of historic architecture and modern development, where every street corner seemed to whisper stories of transformation. Through a state housing assistance program for foster youth, Sarah was granted a modest apartment downtown. The unit was plain, a square room with beige walls, linoleum floors, and a kitchen barely big enough for a table. But to Sarah, it was a blank canvas. She threw herself into redesigning it, painting the walls a calming sage green, sanding down thrifted furniture until it gleamed, and sewing her own curtains. The apartment became her sanctuary, a space that reflected her journey from emptiness to creation. It was during this time that Matthew re-entered her life in a more permanent way. True to his promise, he had never stopped visiting her during foster care, and now, as young adults, their paths converged again. Matthew had chosen a career in construction, apprenticing under an architect in Des Moines. His days were spent on job sites, learning the balance between structure and creativity, between concrete and vision. The two often met after work. Sometimes they grabbed coffee at a small diner where the waitress knew their names. Other times, they walked through the quiet streets near the river, talking about the future. Sarah told Matthew about her dreams of designing homes that felt alive, homes where children would feel safe and wanted. Matthew spoke about building structures that could withstand storms, both literal and figurative. Their conversations revealed a shared language, a rhythm between them that had started in childhood and only deepened with age. Sarah noticed how Matthew always carried himself with steady confidence, though his eyes softened whenever he spoke to her. And Matthew noticed how Sarah's laughter, rare but genuine, felt like sunlight breaking through clouds. Yet, despite the closeness, neither of them crossed the invisible line of friendship. Perhaps it was fear of losing the one bond they had clung to for so many years. Perhaps it was the weight of their shared past, the knowledge that they had been each other's only constant in a world that had repeatedly taken people away. So they stayed as they were, best friends who knew each other's scars, who could sit in silence and still feel understood. Sarah's apartment became their refuge. Matthew helped her fix a broken cabinet door, patched a crack in the wall, and laughed as she scolded him for tracking dust across her freshly cleaned floor. They ordered takeout on Friday nights, the cardboard containers spread across the coffee table while they argued over movie choices. Sometimes Sarah would fall asleep on the couch, and Matthew would drape a blanket over her shoulders before slipping out quietly into the night. To the outside world, they were simply two young professionals at the start of their careers. But beneath that surface lay a bond forged in pain and sustained by loyalty. They had no family to call their own, yet in each other, they had found something just as powerful. Sarah didn't know what the future would bring, but she knew this. Matthew was the one person who had never left her, and that truth anchored her more than any apartment lease or job contract ever could. Their friendship was steady, unspoken, and unshakable, the kind of bond that would either remain the foundation of their lives or evolve into something neither of them yet dared to name. On the morning of her 25th birthday, Sarah Whitaker woke to a knock on her apartment door. She shuffled across the hardwood floor, still half asleep, and opened it to find a delivery woman holding a glossy white box tied with a gold ribbon. Inside was a gift card for a downtown salon and spa, along with a note. Every designer needs a day of beauty. Happy birthday. Love, the office crew. It was the first of many surprises. At work, her colleagues decorated her desk with streamers and a small cake frosted with pink roses. Her boss handed her an envelope, smiling warmly. You've earned this, Sarah. A weekend getaway. Take it whenever you need a break. Inside was a voucher for a cabin retreat near Lake Okoboji. For someone who had grown up with nothing, the outpouring of kindness left her speechless. But the real surprise came that evening. Matthew had insisted on picking her up for dinner. Nothing fancy, he said with that lopsided grin of his. Just clear your evening. Sarah suspected he was planning something, but she didn't press. She slipped into a navy dress she rarely wore, curled her hair, and tried not to let her hands shake as she fastened the clasp of her necklace. When they arrived downtown, Matthew led her into a restaurant she had always admired but never entered. A cozy place with exposed brick walls, strings of Edison bulbs, and live jazz humming softly in the background. The hostess smiled knowingly as she guided them toward the back. As Sarah stepped into the private dining room, she froze. Balloons floated against the ceiling, their silver ribbons catching the light. A banner stretched across the far wall. Happy birthday, Sarah! Around the long table sat several of her closest colleagues, a few college friends, and even the foster family supervisor who had once encouraged her during her darkest days. The room erupted in cheers and applause. Sarah's hands flew to her mouth. Matthew, you didn't, he shrugged, though his eyes shone with pride. Surprise. Dinner unfolded in a blur of laughter and clinking glasses. People told stories about Sarah, how she had stayed late at the office to finish a project, how she had once painted her apartment wall 3 times because the color just didn't feel right, how she could never refuse helping someone in need. Sarah laughed until her cheeks ached, but beneath it all, she felt something stirring deeper than gratitude. It was the sense of belonging, of finally being celebrated, not as a charity case, but as herself. When dessert arrived, a towering chocolate cake, Matthew stood. The chatter quieted. He tapped his glass lightly, his voice steady, but his hands betraying a slight tremor. I've known Sarah since we were kids, he began. Back then, we didn't have much. We didn't even have families who wanted us. But we had each other. She's been my best friend, my anchor, the person who makes life make sense. Sarah felt her throat tighten. The room blurred at the edges. Matthew reached into his pocket and pulled out a small box. Instead of opening it immediately, he placed it on the table and slid it toward her. Sarah, I don't just want you to be part of my life. You are my life. She lifted the lid with trembling fingers. Inside lay a delicate silver bracelet. Attached to it was a small charm, and dangling from that charm was a simple, elegant diamond ring. Gasps filled the room. Matthew stepped closer, his voice low but clear. Sarah Whitaker, will you marry me? Tears welled in her eyes. For years, she had dreamed of family, of permanence, of not being left behind again. And here was Matthew, the boy who had promised to come back every weekend, the man who had kept every promise since, asking her to be his forever. She stood, her hand shaking, and nodded. Yes, 1,000 times yes. The room erupted in cheers as Matthew slipped the ring onto her finger. He drew her into his arms, and for a moment the noise faded, the lights softened, and there was only the steady beat of 2 hearts that had finally admitted what they had always known. That night, Sarah left the restaurant not just as a woman celebrating her 25th birthday, but as a fiancée. The line between friendship and love had blurred into nothing, replaced by something solid and undeniable. They were no longer two abandoned children clinging to each other. They were partners, ready to face whatever came next, together. The wedding was simple, just as Sarah and Matthew wanted. On a bright spring afternoon in Des Moines, close friends and a few colleagues gathered at a small chapel tucked between oak trees. The pews weren't overflowing, but the people present mattered, the ones who had walked with them through foster care, through college, through the endless grind of building lives from nothing. Sarah wore a modest ivory gown that shimmered softly in the sunlight streaming through stained glass windows. Matthew stood at the altar in a navy suit, his expression steady, though his eyes betrayed the depth of his emotion. They exchanged vows with quiet sincerity. There were no grand speeches, no lavish displays, just the promise of two people who had already weathered storms together. When the officiant pronounced them husband and wife, Sarah felt as though a circle had closed. The girl who had once been left at a foster home now had a family of her own. Afterward, they hosted a small reception in the community hall, decorated with string lights and wildflowers gathered from a local farm. Guests danced, laughed, and toasted to the couple's future. Sarah remembered standing with Matthew near the doorway as the evening wound down, both of them looking at the glowing lights above. "We don't need much," he whispered. "As long as we have each other, we'll be fine." She believed him completely. Married life began in a small apartment they rented near the Des Moines River. It wasn't luxurious, but it was theirs. On weekends, Sarah filled the space with her sketches and swatches, while Matthew returned home with dust on his boots and stories from construction sites. Their shared passion for design and building soon blossomed into an idea. Why not start something together? With their combined skills, Sarah's eye for interiors and Matthew's hands-on experience in construction, they launched a small business, filing paperwork for Design and Build LLC. At first, they took on modest projects, redesigning living rooms, updating kitchens, building decks. Sarah handled clients with quiet professionalism, while Matthew managed crews and materials. It was exhausting, often leaving them up late at night with budgets spread across the kitchen table. But when they walked into a finished project and saw a family marvel at their transformed home, every sacrifice felt worth it. Word spread. Their reputation grew for being reliable, honest, and creative. Within a couple of years, they landed larger contracts, an office renovation downtown, a boutique cafe redesign, even a small housing development on the edge of the city. Each project strengthened not only their company, but also their partnership. They weren't just husband and wife. They were a team, each balancing the other. But amid the excitement of their growing business, a quiet longing took root in Sarah's heart. As friends announced pregnancies and posted photos of newborns, Sarah felt the ache of absence. She and Matthew had been trying for a while, but each month ended in disappointment. At first, she brushed it off, telling herself they were still young, that it would happen when the time was right. But as years passed, her patience frayed. One evening, after returning from a baby shower for a college friend, Sarah sat in their living room staring at the tiny socks she had bought as part of the gift. Her chest tightened. "What if it never happens for us?" she asked quietly, her voice trembling. Matthew set down the blueprint he had been reviewing and moved beside her. He wrapped an arm around her shoulders, pulling her close. "Then we'll still have each other," he said firmly. "Sarah, listen to me. You're enough. We're enough." She wanted to believe him. She leaned into his embrace, letting his steadiness calm the storm inside her. But later that night, as she lay awake beside him, Sarah pressed her hand against her stomach and whispered a silent prayer she couldn't bring herself to say out loud. The truth was, their life together was beautiful. They had built a business from the ground up, carved out a place in the world where they had once been unwanted. Yet, in the quiet moments when the tools were packed away and the lights were off, Sarah felt the empty space where laughter and footsteps of children might have been. For now, she clung to Matthew's words, to his unwavering support. But deep inside, she feared that the life they had built would never feel fully complete. And that fear, unspoken and unresolved, began to linger in the background like a shadow neither of them could fully escape. The evening of Matthew's birthday had started with promise. Sarah wanted everything to be perfect: his favorite restaurant, a new suit she had secretly bought for him, and a celebration that reflected not just another year of his life, but the years they had built together. She had left work early, humming softly as she drove across town to pick up the suit from the tailor. The sky above Des Moines was painted with streaks of orange and violet, the kind of sunset that usually calmed her nerves. She never saw the truck coming. At an intersection on the edge of downtown, a driver ran a red light. The impact was deafening. Glass shattered, metal crumpled, and in an instant Sarah's car spun across the road, slamming into a guardrail. Silence followed, broken only by the hiss of steam rising from the hood. Sarah's world went dark. Matthew was already at the restaurant, waiting when the call came. He answered with a cheerful, "Hey, where are you?" But the voice on the other end wasn't Sarah's. It was a paramedic. Words blurred together. Accident, critical condition. Mercy 1, Des Moines Medical Center. Matthew's hands shook as he grabbed his keys and ran. By the time he arrived, doctors had stabilized Sarah enough to transfer her to a larger hospital equipped for severe trauma cases. The next thing Matthew knew, he was driving north on the interstate, tailing the flashing ambulance all the way to Minneapolis. Hours passed in a haze, the road lit by red and blue lights, his mind replaying every moment of the day with sickening clarity. At Hennepin County Medical Center, a trauma surgeon finally met him in the waiting area. The man's expression was grave. "Your wife sustained a spinal cord injury. She's in critical condition. We've controlled the bleeding, but the damage is severe." Matthew swallowed hard. "Can I see her?" The surgeon hesitated, then nodded. "Only for a few minutes. She's not conscious yet." Matthew scrubbed his hands, donned the sterile gown they gave him, and followed a nurse down the long corridor. The steady beep of machines echoed through the ICU. When he stepped into Sarah's room, the sight nearly brought him to his knees. She lay pale against the white sheets, her body tangled in wires and tubes, a neck brace immobilizing her fragile frame. He moved to her side, his hand trembling as he reached for hers. "Sarah, it's me," he whispered, his voice breaking. "You have to fight. Please, don't leave me." For hours he stayed, barely moving, murmuring words she couldn't hear, reminders of their dreams, of the business they had built, of the life waiting for her outside those sterile walls. Nurses came and went, checking monitors, adjusting IVs, but Matthew barely noticed. All that mattered was the faint warmth of her hand in his. Sometime in the early hours of the morning, her eyelids fluttered. Matthew shot upright, gripping her hand tighter. "Sarah, I'm here." Her eyes opened, unfocused at first, then slowly finding his face. "Matt," her voice was faint, strained. Tears slid down his cheeks. "Yes, love, I'm right here." She tried to move, but pain etched across her features. Doctors rushed in, checking her vitals, warning her to stay still. Matthew stood back, helpless as they worked. Finally, when the room settled again, the surgeon pulled him aside. "We'll need to run more scans," the doctor said gently. "But based on the initial imaging, there's significant spinal cord damage. Even if she stabilizes, the likelihood of permanent paralysis is high." The words struck Matthew like a physical blow. He leaned against the wall, struggling to breathe. Paralysis. The woman who had built a career designing spaces with her own hands, who moved through rooms with quiet confidence, might never walk again. He returned to her bedside, forcing himself to push the fear aside. Sarah's eyes searched his, full of confusion and pain. What's happening?" she whispered. He bent down, brushing her hair back gently. "You were in an accident, but you're alive, Sarah. That's all that matters. We'll face the rest together." For the first time since the phone call, he allowed himself to believe it. She was alive. Broken, maybe, but alive. He pressed her hand to his lips, making a silent vow in that sterile hospital room. No matter what the doctor said, no matter how hard the road ahead, he would not abandon her. The weeks after the accident blurred into a cycle of surgeries, recovery rooms, and anxious waiting. Sarah was wheeled in and out of operating theaters, her body bearing new scars with each attempt to stabilize her spine. Matthew sat in sterile waiting areas, staring at the clock until surgeons emerged, their expressions carefully neutral. "We managed to relieve some pressure," they would say, "but her mobility is still uncertain." At first, there were small victories. Sarah regained sensation in her fingers, the ability to lift her arms, the strength to sit upright for short periods. Each milestone was met with cautious celebration. But as the weeks turned into months, her legs remained still, stubbornly refusing to obey her will. Physical therapists strapped braces to her limbs, urging her to try. Sarah clenched her teeth, sweat pouring down her face as she pushed with every ounce of strength, but nothing happened. Finally, exhausted and humiliated, she burst into tears. "I can't do this," she sobbed, pounding her fists against the wheelchair's arms. Matthew knelt beside her, taking her hands in his. "We'll keep trying. Don't give up." But Sarah's hope was unraveling. One night, in the dim glow of the hospital room, she turned to him with hollow eyes. "You should leave me," she whispered. He froze. "What?" "You didn't sign up for this. You deserve a wife who can walk, who can give you children, who doesn't trap you in hospital corridors." Her voice cracked. "Don't chain yourself to my broken body." Matthew gripped her hand fiercely. "Sarah, stop. I married you, not your legs. I don't care what the doctors say. You are my wife. I'm not going anywhere." His words were steady, but the truth gnawed at him. He was exhausted. The endless drives between Des Moines and Minneapolis, the sleepless nights in hospital chairs, the constant meetings with doctors and insurance representatives. It was wearing him down. He told himself it didn't matter, that love was stronger than fatigue, but the shadows beneath his eyes betrayed the weight he carried. Then came another blow. After a follow-up MRI, the neurosurgeon called them into his office. He spoke gently, his hands folded on the desk. "We've found a mass along your spinal cord. It appears to be a tumor." Sarah's breath caught. "A tumor?" The doctor nodded. "We can attempt surgery, but it's risky. There's no guarantee of improvement, and significant chances of complications." Sarah stared at the wall, her mind spiraling. Another surgery, another round of pain, of false hope. She shook her head slowly. "No, I can't. I won't." "Sarah," Matthew began, but she cut him off. "No more. I'd rather go home and live whatever life I have left than die on an operating table." Her voice was final. The decision haunted Matthew, but he respected it. After months confined to the hospital, Sarah was discharged into his care. But Matthew had been preparing for this moment. Without telling her, he had spent every spare hour planning and building a new home, one that could accommodate her needs. On the outskirts of Des Moines, he had found a plot of land and designed a single-story house with wide doorways, lowered countertops, a roll-in shower, and ramps instead of steps. He poured himself into the project, working alongside a small crew, hammer in hand, sweat soaking his shirt as he fought against exhaustion and fear. When the day came, he wheeled Sarah up the new ramp and through the front door. She gasped, her eyes filling with tears. The house wasn't grand, but it was beautiful in its thoughtfulness. Sunlight streamed through wide windows onto warm oak floors. The kitchen gleamed with smooth counters set at her level. The bathroom sparkled, safe and accessible. Matthew pushed her chair into the living room and knelt beside her. "Welcome home," he whispered. Sarah looked around, overwhelmed. For months she had felt like a burden, a broken piece of the life they once shared. But in that moment, she saw what Matthew had built, not just a house, but a promise, a place where she could exist with dignity, where she could still create a life worth living. She reached for his hand, her voice trembling. "Thank you." Matthew squeezed her fingers, hiding his exhaustion behind a quiet smile. He didn't tell her how many nights he had doubted himself, how many times he had nearly collapsed under the weight of it all. For now, it was enough that she was home, that they were together. But in the quiet corners of his heart, he knew their battle was far from over. Life in the new house settled into a quiet rhythm. Matthew returned to job sites each morning, often working late into the evening to keep their business afloat, while Sarah remained at home, learning to navigate her new environment from a wheelchair. Though the house was designed with her in mind, the weight of dependence still pressed heavily on her. She hated having to call for help each time she dropped something out of reach or struggled to move from the chair to the bed. Recognizing that Matthew couldn't do everything alone, he hired a caregiver, Joyce Miller, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and a gentle manner. Joyce had years of experience working with patients recovering from injuries, and she seemed to carry calmness with her wherever she went. She helped Sarah with daily tasks, preparing meals, managing medication, assisting with therapy exercises. But beyond the practical, she offered something Sarah hadn't realized she needed: companionship. At first, Sarah resisted. She didn't want another stranger in her home, another reminder of what she could no longer do for herself. But Joyce's presence was steady and unobtrusive. She listened without judgment, laughed at Sarah's dry humor, and never treated her like a burden. Slowly, Sarah found herself opening up. In the afternoons, they would sit by the wide living room window sipping tea, and Sarah would talk about her childhood in foster care, about the fear of being abandoned again, about the ache of not being able to give Matthew children. Joyce never offered empty reassurances. She simply listened, and in her listening, Sarah felt lighter. One autumn afternoon, as the leaves outside turned amber and gold, Sarah heard the crunch of tires on gravel. From her spot by the window, she watched as a car pulled up the driveway. A tall man stepped out, his hair silver, his posture upright despite the years etched into his face. He paused at the gate, gripping it as if gathering courage, before walking toward the front door. When Sarah opened it, confusion rippled through her. "Can I help you?" The man's voice was low, steady but tinged with nerves. "You don't know me, but my name is Thomas Bennett. I believe I'm your father." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. For a moment, she simply stared, her mind scrambling. "My father." He nodded, his eyes filled with something between sorrow and hope. "I was in love with your mother once, many years ago. We were young, but she left me suddenly without explanation. I didn't know she was pregnant. I didn't know about you." He swallowed hard, as though the truth pained him. "I only found out recently when she was in hospice care. She told me everything before she passed." Sarah gripped the doorframe, her pulse racing. Her mother had left her in foster care and disappeared without a word. And now, after decades of silence, this man appeared claiming to be her father. Part of her wanted to slam the door, to shield herself from more disappointment. But there was something in his eyes, raw, unpolished regret, that stopped her. "Why are you here?" she asked finally. "I needed to see you," he said simply, "to tell you the truth. And because I think I can help you." She frowned. "Help me." Thomas straightened slightly, slipping into the tone of a professional. "I'm a physician, a rehabilitation specialist. I've spent my career working with patients who suffered spinal cord injuries. From what I've read in your medical records," he lifted a folder he had been carrying, "I believe there's a chance. Not a miracle, but with the right therapy, you might regain more mobility than you think." Sarah's throat tightened. For months, every doctor had offered little but pity and caution. To hear someone speak with conviction stirred something dangerous inside her. Hope. Yet she was wary. "Why should I trust you? You weren't there when I needed a father. You weren't there for anything." His face crumpled. "You're right. I failed you before I even knew you existed. I can't change that. but I can try now. Please let me try." Behind her, Joyce appeared, sensing the weight of the moment. She touched Sarah's shoulder gently. "Maybe hear him out," she murmured. Sarah hesitated, torn between anger and longing. For years, she had dreamed of family, of someone who hadn't abandoned her. And now, in the most unlikely of ways, that possibility stood before her. Whether he was truly her father or just another man with promises, she couldn't yet say. But in her heart, a small flame flickered, the possibility of healing, not just for her body, but for the wounds left by years of silence. She stepped back from the door. "Come in," she said quietly. The weeks that followed Dr. Thomas Bennett's arrival were unlike anything Sarah had known since the accident. For the first time, her days carried a spark of purpose. He visited regularly, bringing equipment and guiding her through carefully designed therapy sessions. With his help, she practiced moving muscles she had thought were lost forever. Progress was slow, sometimes agonizing, but every flicker of sensation felt like a triumph. She didn't tell Matthew. Not yet. She wanted it to be a surprise, the kind of revelation that would light up his face with joy after so many months of worry. She imagined showing him that she could stand, even if only for a few seconds, and seeing the relief flood his eyes. It was a vision she held on to as motivation. So the therapy remained a secret between her and Thomas. When Matthew worked late, she scheduled video calls with her father, following his guidance from the quiet of the living room. Joyce, always discreet, helped her set up the laptop and steady the equipment. One evening, during a particularly intense session, Sarah managed to shift her leg a fraction of an inch. The effort drained her, but the result was undeniable. Tears sprang to her eyes. "I did it," she gasped, her voice breaking. "I love you. I love you so much for helping me." On the other side of the screen, Thomas smiled gently. "I love you too, Sarah. You're stronger than you know." Neither noticed that Matthew had come home early. He stood in the doorway, frozen, his face a mask of shock and fury. The words he had just heard echoed in his mind, twisting into something unbearable. "I love you," another man's voice answering. He saw his wife's flushed face, her trembling voice. Her gratitude poured out like an intimate confession. By the time Sarah realized he was there, Matthew was already storming toward her. "Who is he?" he demanded, his voice raw. "How long has this been going on?" Sarah's eyes widened. "Matthew, no, wait." But he wasn't listening. He saw the laptop, saw the man on the screen, older but still a man, and rage overtook him. He grabbed the device, shoving it aside, and bolted for the door. Minutes later, Matthew's truck screeched into the driveway of Thomas's modest home on the edge of town. Without knocking, he shoved the door open, his fists clenched. "You've been seeing my wife," he growled. "You think you can come into my home, into my marriage?" Thomas barely had time to rise from his chair before Matthew's fist collided with his jaw. The older man staggered back, blood welling at the corner of his mouth. "Stop!" Thomas gasped, holding up his hands. "You don't understand." But Matthew was blind with rage. He lunged again. It was Sarah's voice that cut through the chaos. "Matthew!" She had followed, wheeled hastily out of the truck and through the open door. Now she propelled herself forward with desperate strength, positioning her chair between the two men. Her chest heaved, her hand shaking as she shouted, "Stop it! He's my father!" The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. Matthew froze, confusion flashing across his face. "You're what?" Sarah's eyes brimmed with tears. "My father. His name is Thomas Bennett. He didn't know about me. Not until my mother was dying. He's been helping me fight for my legs. That's what you walked in on. Not an affair. Not betrayal. Therapy. Hope." Silence fell. Thomas stood bleeding, but steady, his eyes locked on Matthew's. "It's true," he said quietly. "I'm her father. I've only just found her, and I would never dishonor her by being anything else." Matthew's fury drained. replaced by dawning horror. He looked at his wife, at the man he had struck, and realization crashed over him. "Oh, God," he whispered, stumbling back. "What have I done?" Sarah reached for his hand, her own trembling. "You didn't trust me. After everything we've been through, you doubted me." Matthew fell to his knees beside her chair, tears streaming down his face. "I'm sorry, Sarah. I was wrong. I let jealousy poison me. I thought I was losing you and I panicked." She studied him, her heart torn between anger and compassion. "Then learn from this. Don't ever let fear blind you again. If we're going to survive this, we have to trust each other." Matthew nodded, gripping her hand as though it were the only thing keeping him afloat. "I will. I swear it." Thomas wiped the blood from his lip, his expression weary but not without understanding. "Grief makes fools of us all," he murmured. "But if you truly love her, let's focus on what matters, giving Sarah the life she deserves." For the first time in weeks, all three sat in the same room, united by pain but bound by truth. The road ahead was still uncertain, but one thing had become clear: secrets and misunderstandings could no longer have a place in their lives. The months after the confrontation brought a fragile but determined peace to the Whitaker home. Secrets had been aired, wounds acknowledged, and slowly trust began to mend. Sarah, though still confined to her wheelchair, approached her therapy with renewed determination. With Dr. Bennett guiding her exercises and Joyce steadying her side, she learned to believe again in the possibility of progress. At first, it was only the smallest of movements, the twitch of a muscle, the faintest bend of a knee. But Thomas saw potential where others had seen only limits. He encouraged her with calm persistence, never pushing her beyond what her body could bear, but never letting her quit either. Joyce cheered each victory, her laughter filling the house whenever Sarah managed to achieve something new. Then came the day she first used the walker. With Thomas behind her and Joyce at her elbow, Sarah gripped the handles, her arms trembling under the effort. Sweat beaded on her forehead as she shifted her weight forward, willing her legs to respond. For a terrifying moment, nothing happened. Then one step, a shaky, imperfect, miraculous step. Tears spilled down Sarah's cheeks. "I did it," she whispered, disbelief coloring her voice. "You did more than that," Thomas said, pride shining in his eyes. "You proved that your spirit is stronger than your fear." From that day, each morning began with therapy in the living room, the sunlight pouring through wide windows as Sarah inched her way toward independence. Matthew often returned from work to find her standing, supported by the walker, Joyce and Thomas beaming at her side. Every step she took was a quiet act of defiance against the fate doctors had pronounced. In the midst of this journey, something unexpected bloomed between Joyce and Thomas. Their long hours together, united in Sarah's care, revealed a warmth neither had anticipated. Joyce admired Thomas's devotion, not only as a doctor, but as a father desperate to make up for lost years. And Thomas, who had carried loneliness since the day Sarah's mother left him, found solace in Joyce's steady kindness. One evening, after Sarah had gone to bed, Joyce and Thomas sat on the porch watching fireflies flicker against the Iowa night. The silence stretched comfortably between them until Thomas spoke. "I've missed most of my daughter's life, but I don't want to miss the chance to build something for the years ahead." He turned to her, his voice trembling with sincerity. "Joyce, when Sarah walks down that garden path on her own 2 feet, will you walk beside me as my wife?" Joyce's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes shining. "Thomas, yes. Yes, of course I will." The engagement brought joy into the household, a reminder that new beginnings were possible at any age. Sarah, watching the two of them, felt something mend inside her. For so long she had longed for family, for a sense of belonging. Now, against all odds, she had it: a father, a second mother figure, and a husband who had never stopped fighting for her. Matthew remained her rock, Though the memory of his outburst haunted him, he dedicated himself to proving his trustworthiness. He rearranged his work schedule to be home more often, cooked dinner when Sarah was too tired, and celebrated her every milestone with genuine pride. He never stopped telling her that she was enough, with or without walking, with or without children, and Sarah began to believe him. By late spring, she could manage short distances with the walker, her steps uneven but real. The day she reached the garden on her own, Matthew and Thomas flanking her at a careful distance, Joyce clapped her hands and wept. Sarah paused at the edge of the lawn, standing upright, the sunlight of the Midwest soft and golden around her. The breeze carried the scent of freshly cut grass and blooming lilacs, wrapping her in a moment of peace she thought she would never feel again. She looked at the people around her, her father, who had finally claimed her, Joyce, who had become family through love, and Matthew, who had stood by her even when she doubted herself. Together, they were no longer fragments of broken lives. They were whole. For the first time since the day her mother walked away, Sarah no longer felt abandoned. She felt chosen. As the sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the yard, Sarah took another step forward, steady, unafraid. In that single act, she carried with her the weight of every scar, every heartbreak, every doubt, and she transformed them into something new. Hope. The image was simple, yet profound. Sarah Whitaker, once a child left behind in a foster home, now standing tall in her own garden, surrounded by family. It was the embodiment of healing, the promise of renewal, and the beginning of a life she had fought fiercely to claim.